So hello and welcome to this series of conversations that we're hosting this month for Global Pride Month. LGBT Great's theme for Pride Month is togetherness, and really thinking about what that means in the context of ED&I strategies and empowering talent in the workplace. So really delighted today. We've got a long-standing friend and ally of LGBT Great, Tom Emery, the former Chief People Officer from Brooks Macdonald and now the founder and director of Hex Development. So Tom, tell us a little bit about you and Hex.
Oh, thanks, Matt, and thanks for inviting me on. It's really good to be here. Obviously, we've been close sort of friends and colleagues for a long time, working for LGBT Great, which I think is a fantastic organisation. So, as you said, I used to be the Chief People Officer for Brooks Macdonald, and that was the end of a 20-something year career in HR, in corporate HR, before I branched out on my own. So, I now run a business called Hex, and we focus on leadership development. So that looks at individual coaching, team and team effectiveness, and broader leadership development. And I also have a big interest in inclusion. And I don't consider inclusion a separate thing. I consider inclusion something that we have to weave into everything that we do in terms of leadership development, because leaders have such an oversized impact on the culture of organizations and how inclusive they are.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, yeah, welcome. And like I say, delighted to have a bit of time with you today, because I know you're a very busy person getting your business off the ground and all the consulting and work that you're doing. And now, one of the things that you've talked to me a lot about recently is the role of a leader in bringing diverse teams together. And I think if we consider over the last few years, that job as a leader has got even harder, right? Given we're in a hybrid environment, we've got teams in different places. So the first sort of thing I wanted to explore with you today is this sense of, what do you see as the leader's role in creating that sense of togetherness within a team and a department?
Well, so as I've just said, in terms of inclusion and in terms of how leadership impacts on inclusion is not something to be done in isolation. It needs to be wound into everything that a leader and a business does. And so really creating togetherness and a sense of belonging and inclusion in a team is like a core part of a leader's role. And I think too many of us think that if we're nice and respectful, or if we just leave our teams to get on with it, then a culture of inclusion and togetherness will happen. And I suppose in my experience, that isn't the case. A great team culture that's really inclusive and in which everyone feels that they belong is something that has to be really worked at. It doesn't happen by accident. And leaders need to put effort into it and ensure those on their team actually are contributing to that sense of togetherness as well. And I think if we go back to, the human beings as a species, if you like, we have a real natural negative bias, and we assess risks and make assumptions all the time without even knowing that we're doing it. So we've got between 60,000 and 80,000 thoughts going on a day. Most of those we're unaware of. And one of the reasons that we're so successful as a species is because we can really create those patterns and act instinctively. But sometimes that doesn't help us. So a leader's role is really about, helping people to engage the part of the brain that makes sense of all these risks that they might actually unconsciously see, and challenge themselves to be more pragmatic and to be more intentional in the way that they operate. So I think a leader, if they want their team to be really effective, they need to be thinking about, how do they call out how well the team works together? How do they call out how relationships work? And how do they stop people falling back on their assumptions and bias, which might mean that a team isn't as inclusive as it could be?
Yeah. And thinking about some of those practical things which you sort of referred to there, and actually in my own role as a leader in our business, one of the things that I constantly work at is, how do we bring people together when they are working in different places? And quite often, actually, if you've got part-time workers or people working in different time zones, it can be even more difficult to connect, like from a day-to-day perspective. So I wonder whether you've got any sort of thoughts on some of the practical things that you've seen leaders do that have been effective, and some of those things that can really make a difference.
So I think there are some easy things and there are some much harder things. And I think, this whole hybrid world means that leaders have to lead, as you've said, in a very different way. And actually, whereas you used to be able to, as a leader, probably, do it a little bit off the side of your desk, and you know, because you could see what people were doing. They were always around you. You could, you know, you could sort of test the climate. You could, you know, get a sense of what people were doing and how relationships were. That's not as easy to do anymore. But I think as a principle, the first thing that leaders can do is make sure that they really understand every individual on their team and understand their circumstances and understand some core things about them so that they can connect with them effectively, and they can work out actually what they need. Because as leaders, we're not here in service of ourselves. We're here in service of our teams and helping our teams to be effective. So, you know, having that connection is really important. So I would suggest that leaders ask, as a basic core set of questions, that they ask their teams for things. So that they ask their team members, what do they love about their role? What frustrates them? Are they clear what's expected of them? And am I, as a leader, clear of what they expect from me? And actually, that's just basic connection, and everything else that, you know, in terms of more connection will happen from there. That gives you like your basic level of knowledge and basic level of trust, so that you can understand what people actually need. Then I think it's really to think about carving out time for the team to talk about how that team is working and how they can change the way it works to make it more inclusive and perform better, and take into account all the different, you know, challenges that people have, the geographical differences, the, you know, the hybrid working, the flexible working, and all those good stuff, all those good things which help inclusion. Yep. And I think that's where it gets to the more uncomfortable bit, because in building trust, people have to get used to saying things that might be difficult in service of the team, in service of the culture, and it's the leader's role really to create an environment which is psychologically safe to be able to do so. So, you know, you've got to be able to encourage people to call out when things aren't right, to call out the things that they need from a practical perspective, so that as a leader you can intentionally break down barriers that stop people feeling included, and help them therefore to work more effectively. And I think that's the way that you build truly inclusive teams, where, you know, where togetherness is really valued and enjoyed.
Yeah. So it's this idea, isn't it, of being really, really clear as a leader in terms of what you expect from each individual team member. And I think the second part there of what, you know, your points was around, well, we also need to be finding those spaces where we do come together deliberately sometimes. And would you say that, you know, you can do that face to face? Can you do that hybrids? You know, what are you seeing as sort of the trends, if you like, across the clients that you're working with?
Well, so it goes back to what the individual needs. So understanding what an individual needs, like, you know, if you've got somebody, say, who might be particularly, you know, who might be more of an introvert, and therefore, you know, might find it difficult to raise their hand on a virtual meeting, then actually, you know, you've got to do things differently as a leader to give that person the space to be able to make a contribution in a different way. I think you've got to find compelling reasons for people to come together. So I work with a lot of organizations where they're, for example, putting arbitrary numbers of days on how, you know, on how often people have to be in the office. And if you're someone who has a preference for not being in the office as much, you might prefer to work on your own. You might have challenges outside work or commitments outside work that make it more difficult for you to get into the office. Then a leader just saying to you, well, you've got to be in 4 days a week and that's just the rule, it's not very helpful and it's not very inclusive. And so, you know, if you want these people to be back in the office and engaging, then you've got to create the environment where it's easy for them to do so. Yeah. So in the broadest sense, I think there is no silver bullet. I think every organization is dealing with these difficulties of how you manage in an inclusive way when the world has really changed. But what I do know is that if you want to be successful at it, you've got to do it on purpose. You've got to try new things, and you've got to really listen to what people need and want.
Yeah, great. And if we can perhaps build on that a little bit, because obviously one of the areas that you specialize in is across talent management. But thinking about now how we can really create that sense of inclusion through the different sort of stages of the talent management process or cycle, and how we can sort of leverage that, you know, with togetherness, you know, so talent management approaches and togetherness. I mean, what are your sort of perspectives on what leaders and organizations can do in this sense?
Well, I think talent management is a really tricky area for businesses because, like recruitment, it's often inextricably sort of wound up with the culture of the business, the people that work there, and like the rhythm and rituals that the organisation has. And it's often quite difficult to challenge the status quo, and particularly in financial services, which is my background, and obviously a lot of the firms that you work with. Moving away from that idea of bringing people in that sort of look and sound most like the people at the top of the organization is quite difficult because of the way that the organizations recruit. So organizations are obviously now starting to get much cleverer with recruitment, like using more advanced tools like AI to screen, and moving more towards assessing skills and capability and using psychometric tools instead of relying on CV chats. And I think that's brilliant, and that should make for a much more inclusive recruitment process as people are tested against their skills and their attitude and their values rather than their experience or their background.
Yeah.
But I think the danger is that diverse hires are then put into cultures that are perhaps not as inclusive as you'd like them to be, and where talent and performance management frameworks are not linked to recruitment and they're not robust. So, for an example, an organisation might do a really good job of bringing in a diverse set of graduates, but if they're put into teams that are sort of relatively homogenous and the leader has no idea how to ensure that the people in that feel that they belong, then the process is useless. So talent management needs to work on the same principles as recruitment, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So make it really clear through the leaders at all levels of the organization and through what talent management frameworks you've got, what good looks like, and to ensure it's based on the quality of outputs and not arbitrary metrics or subjective feelings. So, for example, over the years, I've been involved in several talent discussions where people have said, oh, such and such is a really good guy. He's always first here and he's always the last to leave. Well, that's not inclusive to those that don't have the choice of working all hours. And anyway, why would they want to, or why should they have to? You shouldn't make assumptions about where people want to take their careers. And I often hear people talk about, women maybe who've got young families in a different way than they talk about men in similar positions about their aspirations and about how they might want to, they might want to just have a bit of a break from driving their career because they want to look after their family. And that's an assumption. It's not necessarily true. So I think organizations need to think very, very carefully about how they are approaching their talent management to make sure it does take away some of these assumptions and take away some of this subjectivity, and think about the barriers that might be in place that prevent people from advancing their career. And I also think that taking a risk on talent is really important. So organizations are not going to get it right every time, and we've got to accept that that's okay. So I've seen punts taken on people that might not have the obvious experience for roles or development opportunities, and they might need some extra support, but they've turned out to be absolutely fantastic. So going back to the 4 questions I mentioned earlier, about what a leader should be asking their teams, organizations should really focus on people's strengths, getting them into roles that they can really play to those strengths, because that is what will energize and motivate them, and that's what will take them and their organizations forward.
Yeah, really good thoughts. I think that takes us nicely actually into another question that I've just been thinking about there as you've been talking through. But it's this sort of this idea really of how we develop talents, that is from an underrepresented or a marginalized sort of community essentially within the industry. So, I mean, from the work that LGBT Great done, and of course, that you've seen in other parts of the industry, that underrepresented folks tend to lack confidence, are less likely to put themselves forward, are less likely to speak up, are less likely to have a voice. So I wonder whether you've got any sort of specific thoughts actually on what you think leaders and organizations can do to really empower and support and develop talent from those marginalized backgrounds.
Yeah, so I think organizations need to recognize the system that operates. So it's quite easy often that we focus on the individual. We focus on somebody who's in a marginalized group, and to your point about say that some marginalized groups lack confidence.
Yeah.
Well, obviously we can help marginalized groups develop their confidence, but that really treats them as the problem, and that shouldn't be the case. We should be thinking about, well, what is it in the system that is preventing people from marginalized groups in feeling confident to to be able to progress. And I think, really understanding, for leaders to really understand their people as individuals and understand what the challenges are that they are feeling and what they observe in the system that might be holding them back from having that confidence to move forward. It is going to be invaluable data to work out what actually needs to what needs to change in the system. Yep. So we still have a lot of leaders that talk the talk on inclusion, but don't really take it seriously and don't really think about what they need to do and how they need to behave differently to be more inclusive and to purposefully bring on talented people from marginalized groups. So, they need to put more effort into it. They need to build their knowledge. They need to learn about the lived experience of all the people, whatever background they have, and they need to learn about that lived experience with people, and also really focus on how we bring the majority groups along on that ride, and how we really help the people who are not in marginalized groups to see the benefits for all of being more inclusive and bringing on these marginalized groups in terms of their talents and their strengths, as well as who they are as people.
Yeah, I really like your thoughts there, actually. So it's this idea about how do we make opportunities and access to those opportunities more equitable. And quite often we see underrepresented talent in communities not having equal access to the system, as you call it. And how do we understand what those kind of barriers are? I think, what I see in organizations a bit like you with leaders, there's always really good intentions. There's really good, we're pushing on an open door. People genuinely want to help. But sometimes it's the lack of perhaps visibility or knowledge, or what can I do actually that's really going to make a difference. So I think it is about having that blended approach, isn't it, of looking at what the barriers are for folks, regardless of background or identity, and really thinking about what you can do specifically for each of those team members.
Totally. And I think, just to add to that, Matt, I think it's got to come right from the top. So so I've worked with a couple of organizations recently on similar sort of inclusion work, and they're both at a similar sort of baseline, but the difference is between them is they've got one of them has got a CEO that is really, really visibly bought into this, really driving it with his leadership team. And is really making sure that he talks about inclusion every opportunity that he gets, and really weaving it into just the way that they do business. The other organization is you've got someone who is supportive, of course, but is not doing those things, and the difference in terms of how it's cascading and how it's trickling down the organization is very different. So I think it's got to come from right from the top, from CEOs, from boards, and from executive teams, because if it's not important at that layer, it won't be important to anybody else, and it'll end up being left to the marginalized groups to drive their own progress, and that's not the way that we should be operating.
Now, I've asked you loads of questions today. I'm going to give you an opportunity, if you like, to ask me a question. I know you was interested in what we're seeing at the moment in terms of Pride, and obviously we're in the middle of Global Pride Month. But anything that you wanted to ask me today, Tom?
Well, so I suppose as you said, like, you're working with, you've got a massive membership now. You continue to grow, which is fantastic. So you're getting some insights into some great organisations around what they're doing around this topic and around inclusivity. So I'd just be interested to to see what you see. There's obviously, this is Pride Month. We often see a bit of rainbow washing, if you like, going on from firms that jump on the bandwagon for 1 month and then jump off it again and don't say anything else about Pride for 11 months. So just be interested to hear your observations.
Well, I think you picked up on a really important point there, because there are lots of organizations that do jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, in Global Pride Month, and for some organizations that is the genuine about supporting the community, etc. But I think organizations that aren't thinking about the wider aspects and throughout the rest of the year are at risk, I do believe, of reputational damage, if you like, from the community in terms of building trust, if they're not following through in sort of other aspects as well. So we do see a lot of that happening. I've got to say, within our membership, I mean, one of the reasons people and organizations are a member of LGBT Great is because they don't just work on LGBTQ plus in Pride Month, but they're constantly doing it all year through. So I'd say, to anyone listening, if your organisation, hasn't marked Pride Month before, and you're not focused on the other aspects of DE&I, then maybe think twice about just changing your logo for Pride. But yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing from organisations now is a real, a couple of key focus areas. I mean, the first is making sure that organisationally the firm has got the right policies in place, that they're inclusive to LGBTQ plus people, and that sort of from an organisational lens, it's as great as it can be. I think the second thing we're really seeing focus on now is, supporting non-LGBTQ plus people to understand what they can do, to speak to some of your points, to support this community within the industry. And there's a very specific set of challenges when it comes to LGBTQ plus in this sector, because what we tend to see is very low level of representation of LGBTQ plus women, trans and non-binary people, and the level of intersectionality within the community is quite low. So it's really important that those folks that do exist, within the sector and that are there, that represent those intersections, that we're giving those people a voice and giving those people visibility as well. And I think the final sort of thing that we're seeing is a lot more inter-firm connectivity. So organisations supporting each other, sharing. We run a lot of inter-company empowerment programs, whether it's the role modelling initiatives, whether it's the mentoring program, whether it's best practice forums, etc. So, we're seeing sort of progress across those sort of three distinct areas, but it is really important that Pride isn't just for Pride, and there is Pride after Pride, if you like.
Yeah,
so,
and I suppose the I don't know, the things I see in the news and the stuff that I watch and I read feels like we're sort of going a little bit backwards, particularly with trans people and non-binary gender fluid people. And I would be interested to know, what do you sort of see organisations that are following best practice doing in that area?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big area at the moment within the world of LGBTQ plus, and you are right to point out we're seeing a regression of equality and protections, and general societal inclusion of trans and non-binary people, particularly in the US and the UK. And let's be honest, these are the two countries in the world that are supposed to be leaders, well, the leader, of the free world, and if it's not happening in these countries, then progress is not going to happen elsewhere. So, it is creating a sense of unease for the community. Now, in organisations, what this means is that those that are really genuinely committed to LGBTQ plus, DE&I, are really starting to have a distinct focus now on trans and non-binary visibility, trans and non-binary awareness building. We're actually seeing a number of organisations look specifically at what they can do to support and empower this part of the community. So again, lots of celebration around, trans and non-binary key diversity and inclusion dates across the calendar, but also getting senior leadership as well, executives to create conversations and spaces where learning can happen around this area. And then what I would say, is the area that we're seeing most demand at the moment is definitely around the trans and non-binary space. It's the space where members really want to engage, and is often less developed in a lot of organisations. So we are seeing a lot more focus there. And I think just finally, I'd say a real focus on making sure that, again, things like policies and the systems that talent management has in place are inclusive to trans and non-binary people. And what I would say to any organisation that's listening in, or any leader that's listening in, it's always better to have a really good trans and non-binary approach before you need it. So we often see a lot of organizations, suddenly they'll hire somebody that's trans, and it's like, oh, crumbs, we've got to let's sort out this area now. So I think it's good to get on the front foot.
Yeah. Well, I think it's brilliant that lots of organisations, like often with these things, are well ahead of the government, and sort of well ahead of some of our political leadership. So I think that's brilliant. And and thank you, Matt, for all the work that you do, because I think, as a queer person myself, across my career, I've generally worked for really inclusive organisations, but I think had they had resource and support from an organisation like LGBT, great, some of them would have been much better.
Well, I guess it's all a work in progress, and I think it's good to see, thanks to to visible leaders like you as well, that are creating opportunities for organisations like us. I do believe that looking down the line 5-10 years, we will be in a radically different place, than we are today. So fingers crossed, we can continue on that mission, if you like, to make every organisation LGBTQ plus friendly. But really appreciate your time today, Tom, and all the best with Hex, and I'm sure we're going to see you again really soon.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for inviting me, Matt. It's been
Thank
really
you.
good. Thanks.